As you all know, tonight's talk is by the wonderful Jess Hill. Now, a bit of background about our author. Jess Hill is an investigative reporter who contributes to Radio National's Background Briefing and The Monthly. She has reported exclusively on domestic violence in 2014 to 15 and was the recipient of 3 of the 2015 Our Watch Walkley Awards, including the Gold Award for reporting on violence against women. See What You Made Me Do was her debut book published in 2019. It has been longlisted and shortlisted for any number of awards, but most notably and deservedly, it won the 2020 Stella Prize. Please welcome Jess Hill.
Thank you so much, Justin. I'm sorry, everyone. I've got a bit of a cold tonight. So it's perfect that we're meeting like this, because otherwise I may not have been able to meet you at all. So I just want to acknowledge that I speak to you from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and they are the traditional custodians of this land, the eastern suburbs of Sydney. They sustained and cultivated it for over 65,000 years, and their sovereignty was never ceded. And I also want to acknowledge anybody who's watching tonight who has their own history of family violence. And thank you especially for being here, and probably for the work that you do in this area, because so many victim survivors of family violence continue to advocate on behalf of others. It's what makes it such a, while it's a distressing subject area to be part of, it's also incredibly uplifting to see how many other, particularly women and grown-up children, victims of abuse, who continue to work on behalf of others, even when it's their area of trauma. So I want to talk to you tonight, as I tend to want to do when I get these opportunities, about coercive control, because we don't have a good understanding of coercive control, I think, in Australia. I think we're starting to really build an understanding of it now. But as opposed to, countries in the UK and Scotland, England and Wales, Ireland have all criminalised coercive control. It's been a part of their sort of dialogue for a few years now. We haven't really had so many conversations about it. In fact, probably the first time people heard that term was when Hannah Clark and her 3 children were murdered earlier this year in Brisbane by Rowan Baxter. It was revealed he was a coercive controller. And by that, we're talking about a type of abuse that is not necessarily physical, although it can be, and it can that abuse, that physical abuse, can be sadistic in its extremes. But it is all other kinds of abuse that overall is put towards the end game of coercively controlling an individual or the victim, the children, and basically overriding their autonomy and making them compliant. So we're going to talk about how that happens, why it's called coercive control and not just control, and that's a really important point to understand. But I just want to start off by just giving you a brief look at the stats. So that is that 2.9 million people in Australia have experienced physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner, and 2.2 million of those are women. So that is a gigantic percentage of the Australian population who has experienced intimate partner violence. Now, we don't collect national statistics on the number of children who grew up in these households, but studies suggest that it's as high as 1 in 4. And in fact, in South Australia, one of the most shocking statistics I heard when researching the book was that 1 in 4 children in South Australia had been subject to a child protection notification. So we're talking about incredible numbers. So when we're talking also about, women and men who experience intimate partner violence in Australia, we've also got to remember there are countless adults who grew up with it as children and whose trajectories in life have been significantly redirected by the abuse that they had to navigate as children. And in that way, it's really important also that we bring men into this conversation. There are a lot of grown men who experience domestic violence as children, some as adults. And it's really important that they don't feel excluded, and that this is just about women and children who apparently, don't grow up to be adults. Now, we have a system in Australia that is just totally unsuited to this phenomenon, so that many women feel there's no choice but to stay in a relationship that is often a direct threat to them and their children's lives, and especially, to their sanity. Now, this book that I wrote took a really long time. It wasn't meant to take quite so long. It took about, well, what's my maths like? Probably about 6 or 7 times the number of months I thought it would take. So it was, yeah, I'm not sure if I've quite got that right. But anyway, it was supposed to be about 6 months, and it ended up being about almost 4 years. And it actually almost didn't happen at all. I was, I don't usually talk about this, but since it's just me and a camera, and apparently you guys out there somewhere, I'll tell you that, you know, when I signed the book contract, just before then, I was planning on sort of carving out a new career in reporting on the environment and on climate change. And I actually went for a job at the Guardian, and they rejected me. Anyway, so that pathway sort of didn't feel like it was opening up. And then Black Ink kind of approached me about writing a book on domestic violence and building on the work that I'd done already in 2015, where I'd spent the whole year reporting on it, and especially, you know, half that year reporting on the family law system. And to be honest, I think I just felt many things. First of all, what an incredible thing to be asked to write a book. Who could turn that down? But I felt pretty burnt out. Investigating the family law system is one of the most discombobulating and traumatic things I've ever done. And, you know, I've reported from the Middle East, and I've reported on lots of different things that should be more traumatizing. But it was just like, as I say in the book, you know, it's like walking through the looking glass into a world that's entirely upside down and challenges everything you think you know about the justice system and what it's supposed to do, and absolutely just disturbs you to your core about how impossible it is for protective parents to protect their children in that system. So by the time I'd spent 6 months on that, I think I was pretty close to actually having a bit of a nervous breakdown. So I'd spent about 3 weeks on the front lawn reading Wild in January of 2016. And then this book opportunity came along, and I just thought, if I don't take it, it could be years before someone else gets this opportunity. Maybe never, you know, not never, maybe not for years and years. And when I say maybe never, I say that because since the first shelters were opened in Australia in the 70s, no one had written a book like this for the general audience. There'd been academic books, and there'd been, you know, victim memoirs, but no one, and when I say no one, I mean like no one worldwide, you know, aside from Erin Pizzey, who founded the first women's shelter in the early 70s, who wrote the book Scream Quietly So the Neighbours Don't Hear. That was written in the 70s. That's the last time anyone wrote something really for the general audience. And in fact, when Rachel Louise Snyder brought out her book, No Visible Bruises, in the States, she said so in the introduction. No one's written a book like this. So we were sort of writing our two books at the same time. So I felt this real responsibility that, you know, if you're going to do this, you've really got to do it properly. So even though I said to my publisher, oh, yeah, I'm a journalist, I'm not one of these authors that needs years to write a book. Who are these people? You know, I'll write it in 6 months. What I knew immediately, especially as I, you know, the first 3 weeks of those 6 months was diving down this rabbit hole trying to define what is power. It was pretty obvious pretty early that, like, this is not just going to build on, you know, I'm not just putting together a bunch of stuff I've already done. I'm going to have to really start from scratch and understand this. So I guess that, you know, probably took about 3 or 4 months to really get across that first question that confronts most people, which is, why doesn't she, or why didn't she leave? That was a pretty easy question to answer. And by the end of that, it was sort of like, okay, well, let's answer all the other questions. And there are a lot. When you take that question off the table and you satisfactorily answer it, suddenly all the other questions rise up. And the big question is, why does he do it? So that was really what I spent years wrestling with. And when I say wrestling, I mean, you know, really a big part of me did not want to go inside the minds of abusive men. It didn't want to ask why. It didn't want to look at their internal complex worlds. It just wanted to frog march some of them off into a pit somewhere. You know, like, there was a lot of rage that I carried from myself, but also on behalf of the people who I was speaking to. And, it was really a lot of the fact that I was writing this in close conjunction with my partner, who's a psychotherapist, who would sort of read over everything I'd write, who'd offer feedback, and who co-wrote the shame chapter with me, that he kept on pulling me back and saying, like, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it just feels like exactly the wrong thing to do, we need to know why these guys are doing it if we want to have any chance at stopping it. So I sort of had to contain my rage and confront that in a way that did not excuse them or excuse what they were doing, but that would really, in the end, be the best thing that I could do for victim survivors, both adults and children, so that they don't need to constantly be wondering, why did he do it? Why did he do it to me? Why? And constantly trying to assess that person and all their complexity. I could just give them a bit of a sense. This is kind of why, and I can't tell you why your partner did it specifically, but here's a sense of why this happens, so you don't need to wrestle over it so long. But more importantly, here's a sense to, if you have perpetrated violence, maybe this is a bit of what was going on inside you. And that's why we talk about shame, humiliated fury, etc. So I guess, by the end of that, talking about perpetrators, talking about the experiences of victims, then going into the systems that are supposed to protect victims, but too often enable the abuse, all of that took a long time. And I think what was most confronting was that, within a few months, even of just starting to research it in 2015, I really discovered that pretty much everything I thought I knew about domestic abuse was wrong. And it's the reason I had so much wrong was because on the face of it, it just doesn't make sense. And I think it doesn't make sense to a lot of people that you see, even smart, independent women that will stay with a man who treats them like dirt. Or that, women, after fleeing and being really certain that this is the last time and they're now leaving for good, that they'll return to that man 6 times on average. And it doesn't make sense that someone that to be a good bloke could go home and hold a knife to his wife's throat. Like, none of it makes sense. And often when you're trying to make common sense assumptions about these things, it takes you down exactly the wrong path. And I think that's why our systems get so much wrong about domestic abuse, because actually it's one of those areas where just having interaction with it doesn't necessarily teach you about it, because so much of what you first think when you interact with it can take you down exactly the wrong path and open up a whole sort of unconscious bias or, just a wrong-headed way of thinking. And you may apply that day after day after day in your work as a judge or as a police officer, and think that you're an expert because you deal with domestic abuse every day. But actually it requires mental gymnastics to understand this properly. And I find that even after I'm now in my 6th year of dedicating my life to understanding this and to communicating it, and I still find that I'm learning something new every day and adding more nuance. It is a Mary Poppins bag, which is part of the reason why I'm still so obsessed with it. So, what I really wanted to start off with is to turn the question around from why doesn't she leave to why does he stay and why does he do it, and what makes so many men, some of them who are otherwise normal, lovely guys, not all of them have criminal records, not all of them have massive histories of trauma, although that's, a large percentage. But what makes so many men act so sadistically towards their partners and their children to the point where they'll destroy even their own lives? Like, why do these men even act against their own self-interest? So these questions have taken me years to answer. And it's why I put the words of the perpetrator in the title of the book, which is See What You Made Me Do. Because I thought, even though at first the publisher said, should we really be putting the perpetrator's words on the front cover? I'm like, yes, we should. Because without the perpetrator, I wouldn't have to write this book. So it's about putting the perpetrator up front and center. It's not Mary was killed. It's John killed Mary, And that's why even in the book, when I was first laying out the chapters, I was going to have the underground, which talks about the experience victims have when they're inside the relationship. That was going to be the first chapter I wanted to hear from women first. But then it was like, no, let's put what is going on for perpetrators and what they do, let's put that up front. And to do that, to put the perpetrators up front, and that first chapter is called the Perpetrators Handbook, that felt like a political act to do that. But it felt like every time I felt a resistance being overcome, I knew that I was on the right track, because it's easier to just go with the passive. Put the victim up front, let them carry it, because that's what they always do. The victim always carries it. The victim is always the one who's quoted, because the victim is available. The victim will tell you things. Perpetrators don't want to tell you things. Most of the time, it's very hard to talk to a perpetrator. And even if you do, they may not have the self-insight enough to tell you honestly what is going on, what they really think, what were their true motivations. So we understand domestic violence mostly through the eyes of the victim. But I wanted to do whatever I could to just let the victim take a day off for a minute and put the perpetrator up front and center. So a lot of people have noticed also that I put domestic abuse on the cover, not domestic violence. And I use domestic abuse mostly through the book. I think that, we talk a lot about terms. A lot of people have wanted to replace domestic violence with something more visceral, like intimate terrorism, because domestic violence doesn't even capture what goes on in the household. But and others might want to call it assault or just violence. And I get what they're saying, and the terrorism analogy is not that far off base when it comes to coercive control. But I think this whole conversation misses the point. The reason, and I've gone into great detail about this many times, why I chose domestic abuse, and that Yasmin Khan was the one who put me onto it, a community worker in Brisbane. But, the reason I called it domestic abuse was because I wanted to catch all other forms of oppression that occur. Just as we don't call it child violence, we call it child abuse, because it includes things like neglect, molestation, other things you wouldn't call violence. So I wanted to do that with domestic abuse. But the point is that, when people say we should just call it violence, just call it what it is. Domestic abuse is not just violence. It's much worse than that. In domestic abuse, the perpetrator takes advantage of their partner's love and trust and uses their most intimate details, their deepest desires, shames, and secrets as a blueprint for their abuse. So what we see is like, it's a system that is established. It's not an incident. And unfortunately, when we talk about domestic violence, we often talk about the number of incidents. So you'll see a lot of statistics around at the moment, like the one, for example, around coronavirus. The UN has put out a report saying that if lockdown measures continue for the next 6 months or so, then we can expect about 31 million additional incidents of gender-based violence worldwide. But how do you even measure systems of abuse and violence in the statistic? You actually can't. You can measure a hit and a slap. You can measure those things. But domestic abuse is almost unmeasurable in a lot of ways. And so when people say that domestic abuse is a crime, right now in Australia, that's not quite right, because crimes are incidents. If you get bashed, you call the police, you report an assault. There are criminal incidents that are committed within domestic abuse, but the worst of it can't be captured on a charge sheet. And that's because domestic abuse is not a crime. It's a terrifying language that develops slowly, and it's spoken only by the people involved. One example that always comes back to me from Evan Stark, who wrote that, the book that popularized the term coercive control, talked about a woman who's out on a field playing softball. It's an American, baseball, sorry. It's an American example. And she's playing, there's guys and men and women there. And her partner comes out and says, "You look cold. You should put a jumper on." Now, to everybody else, it looks like he's just being caring, like there's a bit of a chill in the air, she should put a jumper on. But to her, she knows that means that he thinks she's being slutty, because he's established that kind of language and the look he just gave her means that she's going to get punished later on, right? This is stuff that happens in public, but because people don't speak the language, they don't know what's going on. So you can see, and we see this in courtrooms, and we see victims can be reduced to speechlessness by a sideways look or a sarcastic tone from their perpetrator, because they're the signals to which they became hyper attuned, the way that some animals can sense that there's a storm coming. They had to become hyper attuned to every flicker in the face, every little twitch in the eye, to the point where one 9-year-old boy I spoke to said he could read his father's face like an algorithm because he was a keen gamer. So he liked that sort of thing. He liked being able to pick the codes, but he knew that he had to pick the codes. He had to pick when his father was right on the edge, or whether it was a period of safety where he could basically go about his business without having to seek a place to hide. So when in the courtroom, for example, you see perpetrators give these signals, it can trigger fear that's so extreme in victims, especially if they have not seen that person for a long time, that they may not be able to function for weeks. I'm really not exaggerating this. Women have told me they felt suicidal after sitting near their abuser in court. When you think about it, it's only been a few months since it was made illegal for perpetrators to cross-examine their victims in the family law courts. Think about how traumatizing that would be. So, for many victims, even though we put physical violence at the pointy end, the physical crime of domestic abuse can actually be the one that hurts the least. And I'm not saying that is the case for all victims. And really, we're talking about physical, all the other types of abuse. It all is incredibly hurtful. But I think for a lot of women who go through coercive control, particularly men and women, when I say men in same-sex relationships predominantly, women in same-sex relationships, women in heterosexual relationships. I've lost count of the number of people who told me they wished that their partner would just hit them so that they could prove that the abuse was real. And even when you see physical or sexual violence done in abusive relationships, it's usually done in the service of degradation. So the man who rapes his partner and then tells her he's doing it because she deserves it. Or the man who, the woman who I interviewed, her ex-partner tied her to a chair and then held a sword to her 18-month-old's throat, saying that her punishment for being a slut would be to watch her baby die. So they're not just physical assaults. They are attacks on a person's sense of self-worth and their sense of dignity. And they are done to shame the victim. They're done to reduce her sense of self-esteem, reduce her to an almost animal state. And in many abusive relationships, to reduce her to a state of dependency and compliance. So what we're talking about tonight is not just violence, it's not just assaults, it's not just abuse. What we're talking about is a fundamental crime against the victim's sense of self, against their dignity. And before we go any further, and I'll talk for about another 10 minutes and then we'll open up for questions. I just want to give you a sense of the territory we're talking about, because domestic abuse is not just one homogenous phenomenon. So let's clear the way on how coercive control differs from other types of family violence and domestic abuse. So coercive controllers don't just use violence to get power in the moment or to gain the upper hand in a fight. We're talking about people who, we're not just, talking about people who abuse their partners because they're emotionally dysregulated or because they came home drunk from the pub. We're talking about people who use a system of abuse that never switches off, even during the good times. Sometimes there are no good times in coercive control relationships, but other times it can feel like there are good times and there are bad. But this system is always on. Coercive controllers dominate their victims by isolating them, micromanaging their behaviour, from telling them telling or coercing them over what they may wear, when they can do things, where they can go, who they can see, etc., etc. Humiliating and degrading them, monitoring their movements, either through surveillance, through their cars, through their phones, or even through just text messaging them dozens of times a day and demanding to know where they are at all times, gaslighting them, and creating an environment of confusion, contradiction, and extreme threat. So the intent of a coercive controller, even if it's not what they wake up every morning thinking they intend to do, even if it's just something that emerges out of them, but what they basically are doing is getting their victim into a position of compliance. Now, they might do that because they want a partner they can control, or because they are terrified they will be abandoned and worse, left for another man. Either way, the system is basically the same. So what does it look like to train someone into compliance? I want to just tell you an example again from Evan Stark. I don't know why I keep using his examples. We've got like tons of them in the book, but sometimes his examples are really salient. So this is about one of his clients, Dealer, who ended up shooting her husband 4 times. Now, one day, Dealer's husband asked her what would be important for them to buy for their new house. So she listed a few items, and then he said, "What about shades? Are they important?" She replied, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "Well, why didn't you suggest them?" And then he beat her up and berated her for not caring enough. And what he was doing was training Dealer to forget what she thought was important and always try to prioritize what she thought he might find important, which would likely change day to day. There's no way to know in advance what your partner thinks or wants you to say. But that's the point. It's about keeping them on their toes. It's about keeping them in a state of hypervigilance, in a state of constant second guessing. But really what the effect is to try to vacate, to make the victim vacate their own mind and put the perpetrator's perspective front and center. And that's why you talk to victim survivors years later, and they'll say, "Look, intellectually, I know it was abuse. Intellectually, I know what he said to me was wrong. Intellectually, I know that I was not all the things he told me I was. And yet, in my core, I know he was right." Because they've had to inhabit the perpetrator so totally that it is very difficult to excavate. It's like trying to exorcise a spirit, like they have literally inhabited you, because that was the only way that you could stay safe, was to let them inhabit you so that you could protect yourself. Because by following your own instinct and by following your own natural responses to things, often made it more dangerous. So this is the trap of coercive control. So only your compliance can prevent the perpetrator from hurting you, hurting your friends, family, or pets. And this incredible mental effort where you're constantly trying to think about how to protect yourself and the people or things that you love, they draw you further away from recognizing your own needs and deeper into his web of abuse. Now, in heterosexual relationships, coercive control is almost strictly gendered. It's usually almost always perpetrated by men, but not exclusively. There are females who perpetrate it, especially when they have access to power. If they may be in the police force, or they may have some sort of access to power they can use to intimidate. In same-sex relationships, however, both men and women perpetrate this type of abuse. So when someone's being coercively controlled, the perpetrator becomes the most powerful person in the victim's life, and their psychology is shaped by the perpetrator's actions and beliefs. And it can be really hard to convince them that there's any way they could be safe, because they're convinced that no part of the system can possibly protect them from somebody like this. And too often, especially when it comes to the family law system, they are right. And the problem is that we have in our system at the moment is that too often there is nothing to come between the victim and the perpetrator. So I was in Stockton the other day, and I was with a private security group installing security cameras and checking a victim survivor's phone for spyware. She'd left her ex-partner about a year earlier. They'd only been together 6 months, but he was stalking her relentlessly. He was sending other people around to stalk her. They were entering the house at night, leaving signs that they'd been inside the house. He'd written extremely graphic things on the wall in her kitchen. It was just like she couldn't leave the house. She felt like she was a perpetual prisoner. She complained to police. Police wouldn't do anything. It was like no one would just step in and protect her. No amount of well-being checks on her is going to make the difference. Police turn up at 2:00 in the afternoon. She's all right at 2:00 in the afternoon, but at the night time, she can't sleep. So she doesn't go to sleep till the sun rises, because she can't feel safe until then. Who is going around to check on her ex-partner and say, "Mate, we don't have evidence on you. But we know from looking at what's happened to her, we've got forced entry, we can see a broken window, we can see a broken fly screen. We know the lock's been jiggled with. She thinks it's you. There's nobody else it can be. Just know we've got eyes on you. You know, what's to stop police from doing that? And other jurisdictions in the world that I've looked at, that's exactly what happens. Visibility, showing the perpetrator that police know what is going on. So I think that too many women think that if they leave, they are going to be in a situation where they will not have control, or any type of control that they might have had inside the house in terms of being able to be psychologically sort of in tune with the perpetrator and manage them as they think they can do, and as they do to an extent. And they don't know where they're going to be. So it's like this, they might be taken to family law court. The police may not believe them. There's all these dangerous things that exist outside the relationship, and no woman can choose to end the abuse. Only the perpetrator can choose to end the abuse. The woman can choose to end the relationship, but she doesn't get to choose to end the abuse. So coercive control particularly is something that can go on for years after a relationship ends. Can a victim improve their lives by leaving? 100%. But might their life feel harder because they've got a family law case that goes on for 10 years, or because they get stalked, or because, like, worst case scenario, as so many women do after leaving, they end up being killed. I mean, like, yes, life can get worse. We like to encourage women to feel like that, given the right help, that they are going to be better off outside of the relationship. But it's not a guarantee, and that's because our system fails women. Our system fails children. Our system fails all victims of domestic abuse. It should not be that they can't be guaranteed a safe life outside their relationship. That should never be the case. It should always be that they can be guaranteed protection and independence once they've left. It should be that they should be able to get protection and independence even if the relationship continues. They should not have to be responsible for their own safety, and they shouldn't have to leave to be safe. That's a complicated area that we don't have time to get into tonight. I want to say also that there's new research from the UK by Emma Katz, for anybody who's interested in this area. She's done a lot of research now on children and the effect of coercive control on children, and that being in a coercively controlling household, even when no physical violence is present, can create the same lasting harms for children as direct physical or sexual abuse. Now, in households around Australia, coercive control is the most dangerous form of domestic abuse, one that is 7 times more likely to indicate potential homicide than physical violence alone. Now, this is why I'm really doing what I can to advocate for new laws to criminalise coercive control. But laws do not change culture. Laws do not absolutely guarantee the enforcement of such laws, as anyone who's had an AVO and had breaches to that AVO can probably attest. Breaches on AVOs, for people who don't know, restraining orders, protection orders, are terribly under-enforced and give the perpetrator the idea that they can act with impunity a lot of the time. So I know that just criminalising coercive control, that's not guaranteeing that we're going to see a better response to domestic abuse. But in doing as Scotland has, if you criminalise coercive control and at the same time you do not only training for police, for the judiciary, for anyone who comes into contact with victims of perpetrators, but you also institute a system of accountability, especially for police, around responses, that is where we're going to start to see the cultural change. I had a conversation last year with the former lead for domestic abuse in Scotland, former police lead, who said the genius of their legislation in Scotland, where they criminalised it in 2019, is that all of the harms are included under the one charge. So physical, sexual, psychological, control, threats, surveillance, it's all considered equal. And there doesn't even need to be any physical or even sexual violence present for a charge of coercive control to be laid. And critically, the law does not make a distinction between those who intended to cause physical or psychological harm and those who were reckless as to whether their behaviour could cause harm, because that's what we know about perpetrators, that some use coercive control instrumentally, like as a modus operandi in all of their relationships, while others recreate the same techniques of coercive control spontaneously, almost unconsciously. But whether it's instrumental or instinctive doesn't matter to the victim because the harm is the same. So whether a guy puts a GPS tracker in their partner's car, because that's what they do to all their partners, they want to have complete control over them, and that's just how they set out in the relationship, or whether they tell themselves they're putting the GPS tracker in their partner's car because they're worried about them and that's the only way they feel they can protect them. One does it with the intent of controlling, one does it with the intent on protection. It's all the same. So that's what the Scottish legislation recognises. But for me, this is my last point before I go to quick questions, what my ideal would be that we do two things in parallel. That would be to criminalise coercive control, conduct the training and introduce the accountability that goes along with that, and also roll out a system of police stations for women. This is a fundamental problem that we have. Most victims don't want to report to police. Most police are men. 80 to 85% of sworn officers are men. Most first responders are men. You might get domestic violence liaison officers who are specialists inside police, local police forces, local police units. They're not the ones usually who are going to turn up when you call 000, and that first police response is absolutely critical. 20% of victims who've experienced abuse, who are experiencing abuse right now, have reported to police. So that's 80% of people who've experienced abuse, who are experiencing it right now, have never reported to police. And even then, police in Australia are responding to a domestic abuse call out every 2 minutes. So women don't report for lots of reasons, but a big one is that police response is inconsistent. And when you're faced with a very masculine and highly misogynistic culture, it's a bloody crapshoot as to what kind of response you're going to get. So in several countries around the world, but particularly in Latin America where they were first started, these police stations for women are absolutely revolutionising the reporting of domestic abuse. And they have all the regular powers of police. They conduct investigations, they make arrests, but that's where the comparisons end. So most of the police officers inside these stations are women. They are set up in brightly painted houses where women can access all of the services they need under one roof. They've got lawyers, social workers, psychologists, financial, medical aid. A carer will even take care of the woman's children while she's being interviewed by police. So, and most critically, and for the wonks who are watching, the policy wonks, the police don't report to the same ministry. They have a totally different reporting structure, because their one and only responsibility is to help victims of domestic abuse. They're not there to protect property. They're not there to protect the state. They go out into the community and they look for people who are experiencing domestic abuse. They go to the churches, they stand outside and they hand out pamphlets. They even go to hospitals where women have gone into the emergency rooms and they make themselves known to those women. They are proactive. They hand out Christmas presents at Christmas time in the local neighborhoods or barrios, and they embed themselves in the community. And the results are really compelling. So a 5-year study from Brazil showed that where these stations originated, the neighborhoods that host these police stations for women saw their domestic homicide rate drop by 17%. And in metropolitan areas, the drop was much bigger. Among women aged 15 to 24, which is the highest risk age for domestic abuse, domestic homicides were halved. So I'm talking to politicians and whoever will listen about that. Kerry Carrington, a Queensland University professor, has done amazing work on women's police stations and looked at how they can be applied in Australia. I would like to see a totally different way of policing domestic abuse. I'd like to see the actual whole gamut of domestic abuse criminalised so that it may be responded to accurately instead of just responding to incidents. And I want to see us start to believe that domestic abuse can be stopped. The domestic abuse can be reduced now and not in generations to come, not when the patriarchy is overthrown, not when we have gender equality, but right now. So thank you for listening to me talk into a round dot on my computer. And now I'm open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was absolutely fabulous. And I know I'm not the only one who thought that, because there are so many questions coming in. And so what I'm going to do now for everyone is I'm going to start reading out the questions. If any are similar to others, then will skip them. And if you do need any more information, I'm sure we can sort that out another time. But we're going to just start with first question. I won't mention names either. I think we'll just keep it anonymous if that's all right with everyone. So, hi Jess, thanks for taking on this incredible topic. Can you please expand on your assertion that society says that if men fail to be real men, they will end up poor and alone? Doesn't evidence suggest that men do better economically than women? So why would they fear poverty?
Yeah. So what we're talking about is a socialization of men that says, like, if you're not an autonomous, logical, unemotional, strong individual, that you will fail, and you won't be successful. That success is basically measured by how men can live up to the standards of masculinity. And one of the things, the ways in which, it's drummed into men is it's not explicit. They're not told, there's no class that takes them in and says, now listen here, but basically the idea is that if you'll be exiled from successful society unless you can prove yourself as a real man, and look, some cases that might not be true. It's not necessarily that they will end up poor and alone. That's what the belief that is drummed into them is, that they won't be able to get the girl, they won't get the job, they just won't succeed, they'll end up failing. And the way that starts to become drummed into boys is quite young. It's around what Terence Real and I talk about this a bit, because I think it's really important, around 5 or 6, around that really young age, before you really even can remember what life was like before. And it's what he calls the normal traumatization of boys. And he calls it normal because it happens. It's not abnormal, and it's not overtly traumatic. It's what is starting the process of patriarchal trauma on boys. And he gives an example. He gives an example of his son, but I'm going to give a different example. And that is of a boy who is in first grade, and he's being called up by the teacher to teach the class a song. And he was taught a song in kindy about angels, and he has night terrors. And so every night he sings a song about the angels to himself, and it helps him go to sleep. And he thinks of them as his angels. They're like his best friends. And so the first and only song that comes into his head is the song about the angels. And so he stands up in front of class and he starts to sing the first line. And this look that he gets, because everyone knows the song, that it's a kindergarten song about angels, the look he gets from the boys sitting down the front is one of, it's a warning. And the message he gets is, do not sing this song. If you sing this song, you are revealing yourself as a little weakling, as a total, like as someone who doesn't know what it is to be a boy, as a girl, which is the worst thing possible, for boys to be. And it's a shaming process, but it's not, the boys aren't having a go at him. They're not calling him names. They're not bullying him. It's like this shared knowledge where it's like, don't do this. Just don't do this. And what Donald realized in that moment is, if I go ahead and sing this song, it is irretrievable. I have ruined my life. This is his feeling at that time. So he says, when he sees them, he says, oh, and stops himself and says, oh, it's just kidding. And then he turns around and sings the battle hymn. And he said later, he became a psychoanalyst later on in life, partly to atone for what he says was a betrayal of his angels. And he says when he betrayed his angels in that moment, he never quite got back to a feeling of emotional authenticity. And it started this whole thing of needing to be strong, needing to be unemotional, needing to be all the things that boys are supposed to be. And that's what I'm talking about when I say men think they'll end up poor and alone. What I'm saying is that from that very early stage, boys are conditioned that, like, if you don't be all the things men are supposed to be, and if you're a girl, even worse, girly, then you are not going to succeed.
Wow, that's an amazing answer. So next question. How do we convincingly convey the paradigm shift that is needed to start the transformative change? That is, to understand why this happens, what the perpetrators actually do, and why the perpetrators need to do this.
How do we start the conversation?
How do we convincingly convey the paradigm shift that is needed to start the change? So
Okay.
I guess that's about conversation. Yeah. How do we actually start talking about it, and how do we convey what is actually needed to happen?
Sure. So partly I think it's about, like, that's why I wrote the chapter on shame and humiliated fury, and it's why I co-wrote it with my partner, who is a man, which it helped, and it helps also that he's a queer man, so he's bi. I think he just has more insight. I don't know. It just seems to help that he's got that queer way of thinking. But he really, I think what he did was help me get into the what it feels like to feel humiliated by things that on the surface of things, A, should not be humiliating, B, were not intended by your partner to be humiliating, or just wasn't, your partner did nothing at all, to the point where it's sort of like a guy misplaces his keys, but he can see his partner seeing him misplace his keys, and he feels humiliated in that moment, as though a man who is in control doesn't lose his keys, and I've been seen as being out of control. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to blame you for losing my keys. And so even guys who are not abusive might go through that loop, but a guy who's abusive might take that one step further and absolutely go on and on and on about it, may use physical violence, may just be humiliating and degrading, but as a way of taking the emphasis away from his humiliation and reasserting himself as a powerful agent, right? Part of what is really important in this paradigm shift is to go, let's try to understand what's going on. And I'm not talking about victim survivors do enough to try to understand why their perpetrator does what they do. I think it's fine for them to stop trying to understand, to be honest. And it's time for us to take on that burden. But to really try to go, what is going on inside their heads? It's not just that there are gender drivers of violence and that this is all about inequality. And if we get to a greater state of gender equality, we're going to fix this. This is about what men are conditioned to respond to, how they're emotionally habituated, how the fact that whole Margaret Atwood quote, women are afraid men will kill them, men are afraid women will laugh at them. That was the thing that started me off on the whole journey of understanding why men do this. Why are men afraid that women will laugh at them? Like, that is fucking ridiculous, but that is those little skeleton keys are what get us into this territory. But most importantly, we need to just come at it in a way that's not excluding dudes and saying, you're all doing it for power and control, you're all doing it for privilege, you're doing it because you can. All those answers, they don't speak to guys at all. And I'm sort of done with just speaking to women about this, because women have carried the burden of this for so long. It's like the paradigm shift needs to come in speaking to men. And sometimes in the best feedback I've had on the book, and what's opened men up to actually listening to what's going on to women and children, is in them reading about patriarchy, that it's not just a system of men's power over women, but it's a system of men's power over other men, and what happens around that normal traumatization of boys process, the fact that patriarchy screws them over as well. The whole thing around shame and how shame drives their responses without them even knowing it, and is behind so much of their anger. Those sorts of things, it's like it opens up a space for men to be able to talk about it and not feel like you're going to be, humiliated for getting it wrong, and not feel like you're just bad from the outset, because you're a guy, and you're not welcome in this discussion because you've already done enough damage, so. And it's a tricky thing because guys in this discussion can take control. They can do all, it's a very difficult balancing act. But that's the paradigm shift we need to get, is talking to guys.
I have so many more questions, so we're going to try to get through a couple more real quickly in the last 10 minutes. Someone just wants a clarification on what you were saying about the courtroom and the cross-examining by the perpetrator. That has stopped now, hasn't it?
Yeah, in family law, yes.
Great. We're going to leave that one because we've got so many to get through. Question, Jess, what do you do to maintain your mental well-being while covering domestic abuse? Oof.
Not enough. When I was writing the book, briefly, I just, my mental health did not flourish during that time. But the reason why was I was obsessed. I needed to know everything there was to know about domestic abuse. I needed to know it inside out, backwards. I needed to know everything about the experiences that women were having. I needed to know why men were doing it. I needed to know children. I needed to inhabit it all. And I needed to be a vessel. So to be honest, the idea of going out and having fun, talking to friends, or even exercising and doing self-care was just anathema to what I was trying to do. I just wanted to be a channel for this to come through. So in a way, my lack of self-care was kind of fundamental to the writing of the book. I wouldn't suggest it for anyone. Please don't do it at home. It was actually awful. Like, it's not a good place to be, and my marriage got like this close, like it's not sustainable. Now in my work, now that I feel like I've done that, my self-care is entirely different. Like I do all those things. I exercise, and, having a baby was actually quite helpful because they're quite joyful and lovely to spend time with when they're not, crying and pooing. But that was helpful. So yeah, I all of the self-care is necessary, but during the book, I just didn't. And I put my body in a jar at the back of the cave, and I plugged my brain in and my heart and just put them in front of a computer.
Definitely don't do that at home, folks.
No, don't do it at
home. Someone here has asked, they're really interested in what you said around men will sacrifice their own lives to abuse their partners. And they've asked, do you have any comments as to why that is?
Because they are totally, well, that's the shame thing, right? This thing of like deeply unacknowledged shame, where they are absolutely like trigger wired for humiliation, and it's like, instead of doing the work that's necessary to actually be able to be in an intimate relationship, they take the easy road out and they replace that sense of shame with power by using violence. But what's amazing to me, and I think what we don't talk about enough, is that this is like a deeply miserable way to live. And some of these guys might like live the high life, like out in public and corporate, but remember, they're coming home and they're like a slave master, right? They're like, and I'm not saying all of these guys are slave masters, but like, let's just say at the top end of coercive control, you're talking about what's really like slave owning, and it's like monitoring the perimeter at all times, constantly wondering where is she, who is she with, constant rule changing. I mean, like, it's not a relaxing way to live, and to the point where this is really interesting, is that the Domestic Violence Death Review team in New South Wales, they decided one year to look at suicides because they thought, well, suicides, we don't pay enough attention to the number of women with domestic violence in their history who suicide as a result of domestic violence, and we don't include that in the homicide stats. So they went looking for suicides where there was a background of domestic violence reporting, and they looked at perpetrator and victim, and they found a much higher proportion of perpetrators had suicided than victims. This is the thing, is it's like, a lot of these guys are absolutely racked by like internal trauma, grief, who are just operating from a position of deep distrust, who will keep this system in place even to the point where they are jailed. I mean, like, that's what we have to start thinking. This is not like a good thing for the perpetrator, even if the perpetrator can't see that because they can't imagine anything different.
So interesting. So many more questions. We're not going to get to everyone's questions. I'm really sorry about that, folks. But here's a possibly quick one, probably not. What are the avenues to get coercive control accounted for in Australian legal systems as it has been in European countries?
Well, at the moment, coercive control, those sorts of things are accounted for in AVOs, like protection orders. So that is enough evidence to account for protection orders. Really, it's about lobbying state premiers or state attorney generals, as I've been doing in various states. I think that a number of them are close. I think New South Wales may be the closest, Victoria maybe. So literally it's just about, and this is a process that needs to go on for like probably a couple of years. Like you don't just introduce, like there's a members bill in South Australia that's tried to criminalise coercive, talking about criminalising coercive control. You don't just whack this together and hope it'll fly. It needs to be in deep consultation with sector, deep consultation with victims who are the experts in this experience, with children, with anyone who experiences this, with the families of victims, and it needs to be nuanced. And it needs to make sure that we don't further persecute already marginalised groups. But essentially what we're talking about is state governments need to make this decision, and they'll probably make it one by one. And other state governments probably watch the first one to see how it goes.
Interesting. Here's a very interesting question for probably our last one, unless you can answer it quickly. The police routinely fail to punish perpetrators who violate or breach AVOs, as you've just said. Do you think a very visual and public form of electronic monitoring could help victims feel safe? Sorry, someone else. There it is. One breach and you are monitored with a tight curfew and locality.
I have heard that suggested, and I'm sure there's civil liberties stuff to talk about there, but like given what we're dealing with, whether civil liberties can be outweighed there, certainly sex offenders often have a monitoring bracelet. You'd be looking at a very, very large scale. Like literally like tens and tens of thousands of people on AVOs. So that I don't know what the requirements would be for that type of system, but I don't think it's outrageous.
All right. Well, we'll fit in one quick question as well. I know this is a tricky situation, but what are your thoughts about working with both partners when she is too scared to leave the relationship?
In terms of counselling, or?
I expect as much, yeah. They haven't really said any definitively.
I think it's really about assessing as best as you can what the situation is, because if it is a situation of coercive control, couples counselling can make things worse. Really, you're talking about like ideally working with him first, and communicating with her, because he's the one that needs work. I'm sure like she probably needs help in lots of different ways, but he's the one that needs to change his behaviour. I think couples counselling can throw up a lot of very problematic issues, especially around if she discloses things in couples counselling because she's made to feel like she's in a secure environment, they may be used against her later. It's just, it's too hairy to do couples counselling where coercive control is present. But if it's domestic abuse in a way that's much more situational and sort of lower grade, where control and a system of abuse is not as present, but it's just in that grey area, highly dysfunctional, where there may have been incidents of violence, that's kind of a different situation, right? So it's just about assessing what you're looking at. But coercive control, no.
It's such a fine balance. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time with you tonight, Jess. I can't thank you enough. And on behalf of everyone here tonight, I would like to thank you for your insights into this difficult topic. And thanks to everyone who attended one of our online author talks. We really hope to see you again at another of these events. We'll sign off now and say good night, stay healthy, stay safe. And thank you all again so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.